right. Hi, everyone. We are currently live, so we'll wait for a few folks to join the broadcast. This will be a live webinar here today. So if you have questions or comments, you can absolutely include your comments and just post them, and we'll be able to see and respond to your questions directly as the broadcast is going on. So my name's Hannah. I work with Family Source Consultants, and I'm here with Ryan Ferrante. And Ryan, I'll have you start by just introducing yourself. Tell us a little bit about your practice.
Thanks, Hannah. Really great to be back with you again. I am a collaborative reproduction attorney, a surrogacy attorney, an assisted reproductive technology attorney, goes by many names. I'm really a lawyer who focuses on third-party reproduction. I'm a solo practitioner in Chicago where I'm licensed to practice in the state of Illinois. And I get this question a lot, as you can imagine, like, what is it exactly that you do? So I usually start by answering that question by telling them that my path to this practice wasn't really an accident. I began my career as a corporate tax attorney, and it was during those earlier years of my career that my wife and I battled infertility for many years before we resolved that infertility. That resolution was only possible with I assume is happening with a lot of people in your audience, which is, remarkable care from medical professionals and the help of the most wonderful surrogate any intended parents could ever ask for. And so any opportunity that I get, I will talk about Stacy, who is forever part of our family, who we did not know before infertility. And she remains very much like a sister to both my wife, Lindsay, and I. So while we were overcoming our own infertility challenges, I pivoted my career as a lawyer from tax to working with families, like I assume, or like a lot of families I assume are in your audience, whether it be in the form of egg donation or sperm donation, embryo donation, and most prominently, gestational surrogacy. So I am independent of any agency or any other practice, and I work with intended parents and surrogates and donors, really all the parties to a collaborative reproduction arrangement like surrogacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it seems like you get it on a personal and professional level then. How do you feel like that has impacted then your work, kind of being able to draw from your own personal experiences?
Yeah, it's certainly helpful in every conversation that I have with my clients. I usually tell them that if they want me to take my lawyer hat off and talk to them one intended parent to another, I'm happy to do that. But it certainly is, it provides me with a little bit of empathy. It feels a little less transactional when the conversations are happening, and I want my clients to know that I am available to have those conversations. What do we do for our surrogate during the arrangement? What was your relationship like? How did you foster that really great relationship? So it is certainly helpful. One thing I always try to emphasize with my clients is that these contracts and these are legal arrangements between the parties. They are not hostile negotiations. They don't have to be. And so, as a former intended parent and as an attorney in the space, I think it's very, very helpful in guiding those conversations because it's a good start to the attorney-client relationship.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I know it's legal so I'm a former surrogate as well. And so legal, I think, is perhaps one of the more not as well known about aspects of it. Kind of some
intimidating. It's intimidating.
Yeah, intimidating is a great word for it. And so I think kind of bringing that people element to it and that personal, touch, I think is really important. So that probably puts a lot of your clients at ease, certainly. So speaking of clients then, for folks who are looking for an attorney, either as intended parents or even as a surrogate, what types of factors should they consider when trying to pick an attorney? Because again, that process can get pretty overwhelming.
Yeah. So I've heard a lot of it, right? I've heard a lot of different questions and answers to using, a family friend or somebody in the family who's an attorney. Let's just get one thing out of the way. Every intended parent and or really any party to a surrogacy arrangement or other collaborative reproduction arrangement should have independent legal representation by an attorney whose focus aligns with their legal needs. Distinction that I make all the time is that my father and my brother are both defense litigators, one in insurance and the other in medical malpractice and product liability. They're very highly qualified lawyers in those areas. But in the same way, I am not competent to represent a defendant in a criminal case. They don't know about the Illinois Gestational Surrogacy Act or the unique needs of intended parents in a collaborative reproduction arrangement. That experience only comes from a commitment to sort of understanding this really evolving legal landscape of reproductive rights, which is a requirement that it requires all of my attention, right? So anybody who is sort of exploring legal representation in collaborative reproduction should only be hiring a lawyer who possesses the legal knowledge and the skill and the preparation for that representation. How you find them, that's a very broad question. I mean, a lot of my clients are, refer to me among many other lawyers by an agency, or if it's word of mouth, somebody who has worked with a surrogate or other intended parents before. And so there's a number of ways, like a connected agency like Family Source Consultants, they're going to give you recommendations for representation, lawyers who they know are experienced in the area and they know that they're competent and effective and that they're going to take care of their clients. You can speak to others who have been through the process and ask them about their experiences with their lawyers. But no matter where you find names of potential attorneys, it's always my recommendation to speak to as many lawyers as you have time for, because you're going to be spending a lot of time with that person. I tell people all the time, look, if you're sick of my voice already, I'm probably not a good fit for you, right? You're going to be spending a lot of time with me talking about all the hopes and desires and intentions for your surrogacy arrangement. The bottom line when it comes to choosing an attorney is that whether it's through the agency, word of mouth, or your own research, make sure that you're engaging someone who has experience in the area, because the differences between this area of the law and something else are not subtle. Hire an expert.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a fantastic point. I think a lot of folks know an attorney, right? But maybe not the right kind. So it's a pretty small niche field. Yeah. You'd mentioned kind of that it's an evolving legal landscape. So if we can just geek out for like a minute, can you talk a little bit about like just the history of it? Like it's a pretty recent field that's even been needed, right? So like, what does that look like over even the past like decade or two?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question, because the answer might change by the time I'm done answering it, right? That's how quickly things are changing. When anybody is exploring gestational surrogacy, this is the way that I viewed it. Maybe this is just the way that my brain works, but I knew that when we were going to be matched with a surrogate, we can probably talk about the impact of state law on the arrangement. But when I was looking at it, I was thinking about a map of the United States where, some states are a little bit recessed, and those are the ones that, like a 3D map, the recessed states are not the states that you really want to be matched in, because the law might be a little bit murky or vague. Whereas in other states, it may be a little bit more clear about what the requirements of the parties are going to be. But from a very, very broad perspective, there's this sort of patchwork of laws across the states where it's, and that's the very nature of our federal system, where every state has their own sort of laws. And state law is going to govern not just the first bucket, I refer to these as buckets, but like the first bucket in surrogacy, as far as the legal process goes, is your contract, right? That's the direct agreement between you and your intended parents or your surrogate. And so state law is going to govern that contract. Much longer conversation that we probably can't settle here as to which state is going to govern that contract, but it's generally the law of the state where the surrogate lives, or where the intended parents live, or where the embryo transfer is going to occur. So there's a number of ways that impacts the choice of law there. Now, the second bucket is the establishment of legal parentage, which we can go into in a little bit more detail. But the establishment of legal parentage is a necessary step to make sure that the legal parent-child relationship has been established with the intended parents in a surrogacy arrangement. The law that governs that process, that dictates how that happens, is always going to be the law where the surrogate delivers. That's the jurisdiction which is going to issue the birth certificate. So how do we get to that end? And so that's surrogacy law across the states at a very high level. But then you've also got to consider other laws, right? How did Dobbs affect, the overturning of Roe v. Wade? How does that affect surrogacy arrangement? That's an element that you're going to want to have a conversation with an attorney about. How does this impact our arrangement to have our surrogate living in Illinois versus living in Ohio versus living in Florida versus living in, any of the other states where the law is a little bit murky?
Mm-hmm. That's a fantastic point. Yes, I feel like we could do a whole webinar just maybe we will. That's
for sure. For sure.
So backing up then, so let's talk about the state laws. Are there certain states where surrogacy, I've heard of surrogacy like friendly states. Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, so let's go back to federalism. I promise I'm not going to, I say this all the time. I don't want to turn this into a law school class, but I think that these are important principles to understand in order to explain the answer. We have this patchwork of laws across the states, right? But I do want to explain my answer in that larger context. We have the contract, we have the establishment of legal parentage. And so we have these differences of laws across the states. Are there states that there is a easier approach? Sure. There's some states like Illinois where I practice. In Illinois, we have a gestational surrogacy statute that defines the requirements for a valid and enforceable surrogacy contract. And then on the other end, we have states like Nebraska, where they have a statute that says something. I'm not a Nebraska attorney, but it says something like a surrogate parenthood, a surrogacy contract entered into is void and unenforceable, which effectively means that Nebraska courts will probably permit uncompensated surrogacy. I don't know. But the underlying contract is unenforceable, right? Even further, we have states like Michigan, where all surrogacy contracts are void and unenforceable, plus compensated contracts are subject not just to civil penalties, but also criminal penalties. So that's the most extreme. And then there's other states like Louisiana, which are very not. I would never advise somebody to enter into a surrogacy contract under the current law of Louisiana. It's prohibited, and they've actually even carved it out just for heterosexual intended parents who are using their own gametes, meaning they can't have donor egg or donor sperm. That's, by the way, that's a blind spot in Illinois law as well, because Illinois law was written in 2005. It's ancient in terms of law, right? 18 years ago, it's ancient already. But it was written at a time where you still are not allowed to use the Gestational Surrogacy Act in Illinois and use donor embryos. At least one of the intended parents has to be a genetic contributor to the embryo in order to be able to use this very simple process to establish legal parentage in Illinois. So, so those are really the extreme states: Nebraska, Michigan, Louisiana, and then you have states that are great, like the Illinois and the states that have recently passed gestational surrogacy statutes of Washington, New Jersey, and a number of other states where those are just a couple of examples. But and then there's states in the middle that don't have a law in the books. They have case law. They rely on judges' decisions in the past that say, yeah, we'll enforce these, right? And so it's you're seeing states like Michigan. Colleagues of mine are now having conversations with legislators in the state of Michigan about introducing a surrogacy bill. It's probably many years away from actually happening, but the conversations continue.
That sounds, so it's very state specific then, it sounds like.
For sure.
And then does it matter? Is it the intended parents state where they reside, or is it the surrogate state that matters, or both?
So backing up, remember, in the second bucket, in the establishment of that legal parentage, it's always going to be where she delivers. Okay.
So it depends mostly on surrogates.
Yeah. So let's talk about it this way. In surrogacy, I should say in any pregnancy, the law traditionally recognizes, in any pregnancy, surrogacy or otherwise, the law recognizes the legal mother of the child as the woman who delivers the child. Okay. And if she's married, the marital presumption of parentage assumes that the child born during that marriage are products of that marriage, and thus they're named as the legal parents. That if we do nothing, right? That's the way the law views it. Okay. That's why we need to do something. Okay. So in surrogacy, we have to rebut those presumptions. We have to present evidence to get the intended parents adjudicated or determined to be the legal parents. That's the purpose of parentage orders, or here in Illinois, what we do is we just file certification statements that are signed by the lawyers and the physician who did the transfer, or another physician in Illinois who has knowledge of the arrangement. All the parties have to sign the certification statement. So it really is very state specific on how we rebut those presumptions, get a judge's order if necessary, and put the intended parents' names on the birth certificate. So it's a conversation that every single intended parent needs to have with a lawyer, whether it be a lawyer in their own state or somebody who is licensed to practice in the state where the surrogate resides. You're probably going to end up speaking to an attorney where the surrogate resides anyway. But you really should be having a conversation so that a lawyer who is focused in this area, who understands the totality of all of the circumstances of the case, because we could have those cross-jurisdictional issues where intended, I'll give you an example. My own surrogacy, my wife and I live in Chicago. We are residents of the state of Illinois. We were patients at a clinic in Colorado where the embryo transfer occurred, and our surrogate lived in Florida. And so what law is going to govern the contract, and which state's law is going to govern the parentage process? For us, it was all Florida. For us, it made sense that Florida law governed everything. That may not be the case in another similarly situated arrangement with similarly situated intended parents.
Interesting. And you were going through the process before you were an attorney in this field?
Yeah.
And had to learn it as you were going?
Yeah. So a lot of the things that I've said here today are things that when my wife and I were going through this, I sort of threw myself into the law because I wanted to understand what I needed to understand. Right. So for me, it was practicing tax law in New York, even though I was living in Chicago, but also trying to understand this very seemingly complex legal landscape when it came to surrogacy. So, reading the Florida gestational surrogacy statute might have been a little bit more exciting to me as a lawyer than, and some other intended parents are like, I don't somebody tell me what that thing says, right? It's not long, but it can be very complicated for someone who hasn't seen one of those before.
Yeah. And you know what, like as a surrogate going through it, I don't think I understood parentage. Like I think I just signed what I was told to sign and that was fine. But kind of a caveat for everyone watching, like just ask questions. And if you're not understanding something, like I think that's really important because honestly, these conversations with you is how I learned some of these things that I feel like maybe I should have, picked at a little bit while I was going through the process myself. So yeah. That's important. So how does this, and just also for folks watching live currently, if you do have questions, again, we are going to wrap up in like a few minutes here. I do have some other questions before we do, but if you have questions, viewers, you can absolutely put those in the chat. But I would love to hear about how, we've talked a lot about states and in the United States. Now, I know that we do work with intended parents who are international. So do you know how the legal process is impacted internationally, or how would this conversation be relevant for folks watching abroad?
Really, really good question. So this is where we're getting, not only, I haven't said this, I don't think, but the answer to that question, whether they're international intended parents or domestic intended parents, it's always going to be, it depends, right? A very lawyerly answer is it really does depend on where the surrogate is going to deliver, right? Where the surrogate intends to deliver is always going to impact how this is going to work for international intended parents and domestic intended parents. The question then becomes, Ryan and Lindsay had their child born in Tallahassee, Florida. We got in the car and we went home to Chicago, right? And so the one hurdle that extends for international intended parents is bringing their child home. And so there are passport and citizenship and immigration issues that will have to be addressed in their home country and here in the United States. And so there has to be local counsel communicating with counsel in their home country about what they need to be able to get home. And so that's a very lengthy conversation. Just know that there's additional steps that need to be taken by international intended parents to be able to get out of the United States once the child is born and bring their child home with proper immigration documents.
It sounds complicated, but if you have a good attorney on your side, it sounds like they can kind of walk you through it.
Being an attorney requires certainly a lot of hand-holding, and that's the very nature of the job is making sure that you're thinking 3 or 4 or 5 steps ahead of where the intended parents are at that moment.
Absolutely. So no matter where the intended parents are coming from, do you have advice for prospective intended parents or folks kind of getting started in the process and things they can be kind of reading up on now so that they're more prepared for a conversation with an attorney? So do I want intended parents coming to the table with a whole bunch of questions? Let me answer it this way. I will say that, and I'm going to take my lawyer hat off for this one because I have sat in that chair and thought to myself, gosh, what am I supposed to know? Am I supposed to come with a whole list of criteria and questions and all these things that I'm supposed to be thinking about? I think it's reasonable, and it was certainly reasonable for me and Lindsay, for any intended parent to expect their attorney to walk them through the things they need to think about, right? So, for example, if we just talk about that first bucket where we talk about the contract between the intended parents and the surrogate, one thing that the intended parents may not know, or surrogates may not know, you certainly know this, Hannah, is that the intended parent's lawyer is the one who drafts it, right? They get the first crack at it. So their hopes and their desires and their intentions for the arrangement are sort of memorialized first, right? Again, should intended parents know everything that's going to be in that contract? Of course not, right? Do all intended parents know, for example, why we put travel restrictions into a contract? Of course not, right? Not all of them, right? Even if they do, maybe they don't really understand all the reasons why, right? Do they know how to, say, define the responsibility for expenses for pregnancy-related medical care? Probably not, right? Now, of course,
most intended parents come into surrogacy with some of their own ideas about, for example, the conduct and lifestyle of the surrogate during the pregnancy, right? That's also my job to tell them, are you starting this relationship off on a very, very bad foot, right? But they can be assured that every lawyer competent that's practicing in this area is going to put up sort of guardrails to protect them, even when it comes to maybe lifestyle, as instructed by the treating physician, right? My philosophy on this is that, I think it should be everyone's philosophy, is that medical instructions are only coming from the physician, right? And so if we are putting something into the contract that is potentially stepping over the line, then we'll have a conversation about that. And that's why they have independent legal representation, because I represent a lot of surrogates. If it feels like somebody is giving something that may be perceived as medical instructions, we take it out. That's just one example of things that intended parents think they need to come to the conversation with. I said, just relax. I'm going to ask you all the questions, and I'm going to create a lens, and I'm going to look through that lens, and I'm going to draft the agreement with that lens in mind. And I think that should probably be the approach on all of these arrangements.
Yeah. So you have essentially a template then for a contract, and then kind of fill it in a bit after conversations with your intended parents. Is that?
There are a number of topics that we must include in every single arrangement. The way my clients view a particular section, say on, let's go back to the travel restriction. And by the way, the reason why we had to have a travel restriction, among other reasons, is because we are going to take steps to establish the intended parents as the legal parents prior to the birth, right? And so we're going to do that in the state of Illinois. I mentioned Illinois earlier. Illinois, we file certification statements to establish that legal parent-child relationship. That happens in the second trimester. That goes to the vital records department in Springfield, and it goes to the delivery hospital. If the surrogate steps out of the state of Illinois, goes into Indiana, and delivers, no one in Indiana knows that she's not the legal parent to that child. And so that's why we put these travel restrictions on starting in the third trimester. I'll let my clients tell other people this, but I think I'm pretty strict when it comes to the travel restriction, meaning I want that to make sure, I want to put the guardrails up to make sure that surrogate is doing everything that she can to deliver in the state of Illinois. All right. Now, how do we do that? We have a conversation about what I think they may want to consider, but then some intended parents will say, we were reading this thing and, we read this story, which happens a lot, right? Of course, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence now of experience in surrogacy arrangements. And so we talk about not just the legal implications, but also the relationship implications on intended parents and their surrogates. I mentioned not wanting to start off on the right foot. I think that there is something that gets forgotten a lot, which is that a lot of times lawyers they're going to step out of the way once the contract is signed and then step back in once the parentage starts. I like to remain as involved as the intended parents want me to throughout the pregnancy, but they have a relationship that is going to evolve with their surrogate. This person's going to be carrying their child. And so, we have to think about it from both of those angles.
Oh yeah. I know I wasn't texting my attorney every week for 40 weeks. For sure. So that's a very good point. Yeah. So it sounds like it's, the legal on paper rules and regulations stuff. Yes. And then there's also kind of, again, this human component to it of like, we're all people, we got to get along, kind of some expectation setting. So
that's right. Yeah. I suppose the question becomes, can you put something like that into the contract? Sure. Do you want to, is another question. Obviously, we're going to do, my role is to protect the interests of my client, but also talk through a lot of the issues that may arise as a result of asking your, I'll give you an example. The big concern medically is that a surrogate is not changing cat litter, right? Because of the adverse effect it can have on pregnancy. Do we want to go so far to say that she can't even take her dog for a walk? That's a conversation.
Yeah.
Because I have been asked to include something like that in the contract.
In a contract. Interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've seen it all at this point.
Yes.
Yes. So that's very interesting. I know we just have, just one more minute here, but I did want to kind of wrap up with any general advice you would give to intended parents, either with your lawyer hat on or without it.
Yeah. I'm going to take it off. I just want to talk about, this is something that I probably have more conversations with non-clients about surrogacy than I do my own clients. Just because a lot of people are, wait, your kids came from, how did that happen? So there's a lot of that. Right. And so, a lot of people who are exploring gestational surrogacy and looking at agencies and looking at lawyers and looking at doctors and trying to understand whether or not they're at the right clinic. It's a very personal decision. There's a lot of gut feeling when it comes to this. If somebody's listening here, I like to think they're actually learning something. And if they are doing things like this, if they're listening to webinars, if they're reading, if they're joining other information sessions where they can sort of absorb as much as they possibly can, you're way ahead of where most of my own clients are when they get to me, right? And so just merely listening to conversations with people like you, Hannah, who have been through this and who share things that they thought about when they were going through the process is really irreplaceable. It's really valuable. My wife and I were very lucky. We had her next door neighbor growing up had just had twins carried by a gestational surrogate. And so we were able to sort of better understand what the expectation should have been by having those conversations. And if you go to an agency like Family Source Consultants, I know Family Source Consultants does this. They offer conversations with past clients or intended parents who have been through a surrogacy arrangement, or talk to a lawyer, have a conversation with a lawyer, things you should start thinking about, because technically your representation with a lawyer may not begin until you have a match with a surrogate. And so maybe having a better understanding of what the legal impact is about that match could be a very valuable conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. And I know that not everybody's open about their journey, and some people are kind of more open than others. But I know that in sharing my own on the surrogate side, I've had people reach out to me from all parts of my life, that even just casual acquaintances, to say, hey, we're going through a very similar thing, or we've been struggling with infertility for years and I had no idea. So, you never know who has been involved in IVF, in the surrogacy world, in, embryo donation and creation and all of those things. So that's a very good point. So just connecting and learning from each other, I think, is the take-home message. Well, thank you so much, as always, for your time, Ryan. We really appreciate it. I know, again, I learned a lot today. I think it was very valuable information for our audience. And we will check in with you. I was going to say, we'll be setting this up again for a future session. Absolutely. So thank you, folks, watching. If you have questions, or again, would like to, reach out and follow up after the broadcast, I know I'm not going to speak for you, Ryan, but I would assume that you are happy to help.
Always.
Okay. Fantastic. Have a great one, everyone. Thanks,
everyone.